The body was found face down, one arm twisted unnaturally beneath it, the other limp over the edge of the mattress. Blood had soaked deep into the bedding, splattered across the white walls in high-velocity streaks. The floor, previously hardwood and clean, was now darkened by pooling arterial spray. A dumbbell, metal shaft smeared with tissue and hair, rested beside the bed frame. Embedded in the victim's skull, just above the right temple, was a butterfly knife, its blade fully buried, its handle still trembling from the force of the final impact. Judith Wundram, 42, was pronounced dead at the scene. Based on forensic data collected during the initial sweep, the position of her body and the location of primary impact wounds indicated the attack occurred while she was lying on her side, possibly asleep. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. Entry wounds were concentrated on the cranial vault and upper thoracic region, consistent with overkill patterns typical in intimate homicides. Most notable, however, was the absence of panic or chaos in the surrounding room. Personal items remained undisturbed. A single candle had been lit on the nightstand, still burning slowly when officers arrived. This level of scene management is operationally significant. It suggests not a reactive offender, but one exhibiting control before, during, and after the act. Crime scene staging behavior, particularly the candle and later discovered answering machine modification, indicates symbolic or psychological intent beyond concealment. The presence of methodical actions amid extreme violence points toward a subject who remained cognitively intact and emotionally detached during the event. In behavioral terms, the perpetrator did not act from spontaneous rage or impulse. Rather, the attack reflects a high degree of instrumental aggression. The selection of weapon, a barbell, was not coincidental. It had been used by the primary suspect, Judith's 16-year-old son, Ethan Wundram, in his recent fitness regimen. Interviews would later confirm his growing fixation on physical dominance and self-image, mirroring characteristics observed in psychopathic ideation. The choice of weapon was not only practical, but deeply personal. The same object used to build his body became the tool with which he dismantled the person who gave him life. Scene reconstruction reveals further insight into psychological state. The victim was partially covered with a blanket post-mortem. Food and water had been left in bowls on the floor, presumably for the family pets. The door to the bedroom had been shut. These are not acts of a panicked adolescent, but of an individual attempting to assert order, or at least narrative control, following a brutal homicide. Covering the victim and caring for animals within the crime scene may indicate residual guilt, or, more likely in this context, a compulsion to maintain appearances and structure. When analyzing offender behavior in parricide cases, particularly matricide committed by adolescent males, certain motivational trends emerge. These typically include a perceived loss of autonomy, real or imagined threats to self-concept, and an emotional coldness that blurs moral boundary lines. In this case, the subject had long expressed dominance over his environment, gradually eroding his mother's authority within the home. Prior behavioral data indicated manipulative tendencies, escalating control, and a fixation with fictional representations of violent male figures. The psychological architecture was already in place. The act of murder was not the start of a descent, but the natural outcome of a long-building internal narrative, one that no longer required permission from reality to manifest. The immediate aftermath further supports this analysis. There were no signs of forced entry. Surveillance of the surrounding perimeter showed no activity. The only known individual present that night was the son, who had arrived hours later at his father's residence, visibly shaken but physically unharmed. He claimed an unknown intruder had committed the crime. This alibi was inconsistent with timeline analysis, forensic trace evidence, and behavioral congruence. From a psychological operations standpoint, the subject demonstrated strategic compartmentalization. He maintained composure, offered plausible distractions, and constructed a false narrative under pressure. Such behavior is common among organized offenders who feel intellectually superior to their interrogators. The careful orchestration of post-crime elements, changing phone messages, feigning trauma, introducing misleading third-party suspects, further suggests a calculated effort to delay or redirect investigative focus. The question remains: what precisely did Judith represent to her son in the final moments before the attack? Was she a maternal figure, a perceived oppressor, or simply the last obstruction between the subject and the fantasy self he had engineered through years of ideological immersion? This uncertainty forms the foundation for the next phase of analysis, where delusion, obsession, and pathology begin to converge. In such cases, the crime scene does not just tell what happened, it reveals how the mind that caused it was already at war long before the first blow was struck. In the months leading up to the homicide, Ethan Wundram exhibited a progressive series of behavioral shifts that, when mapped in sequence, establish a clear psychological blueprint indicative of pre-offense planning. These changes were not chaotic or inconsistent. They followed a pattern of deliberate identity reconstruction, environmental control, and escalating detachment from emotional norms. One of the most critical indicators of intent was Ethan's gradual reorganization of the domestic space. He displaced his mother from the master bedroom, relocated her to a smaller room in the home, and appropriated common areas for his exclusive use. This was not a matter of teenage rebellion. It was a conscious assertion of territorial dominance. The home ceased to function as a shared space and instead began to reflect the subject's desire for full control, both physical and symbolic. In domestic criminology, this kind of unilateral spatial redefinition often correlates with preparatory acts in high-control offenders. Parallel to this was the subject's increasing preoccupation with material identity markers. He began curating a highly specific personal image, purchasing expensive grooming products, name-brand clothing, and referencing fictional figures whose appearance was synonymous with power, detachment, and violence. His most notable fixation was the character Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, a literary and cinematic figure constructed as a charming, affluent killer who maintains a meticulously curated public life while privately engaging in sadistic acts. Ethan's emulation extended beyond costume or surface-level mimicry. He adopted Bateman's routines, speech patterns, and behavioral philosophy. This level of role assimilation suggests the presence of ego-syntonic identification, where the fictional construct is not merely admired, but integrated into the subject's emerging self-concept. The subject also demonstrated increasing cognitive rehearsal of violent acts. This included written notes referencing human anatomy, lethal targeting, and procedural killing methods. In one entry, he outlined a checklist that included killing, dismemberment, and organ consumption, each presented as a task rather than a fantasy. The language lacked emotional tone, reinforcing the conclusion that he viewed these acts through a logistical, not moral, framework. This is consistent with instrumental violence, where harm is inflicted not from rage or panic, but as a means to fulfill an internally defined objective. In social contexts, Ethan maintained an outward appearance of stability. Teachers described him as articulate, academically capable, and well-read. This bifurcation between public behavior and private pathology is a known feature in high-functioning adolescent offenders with emerging antisocial traits. It often allows them to evade early detection by masking underlying disturbance with competence and charm. He had also begun to isolate emotionally, dismissing the value of peer relationships and openly expressing disdain for perceived weakness or emotional dependence. This cognitive distancing is a foundational step in the dehumanization of others, a psychological requirement for intimate violence of this nature. In reviewing his online activity, academic writing, and private notes, it becomes evident that Ethan was not simply fascinated by violence. He was curating a personal ideology in which violence was framed as rational, efficient, and even aesthetically justified. His focus was not on the suffering of others, but on the assertion of personal narrative through domination and death. The victim, in this model, becomes incidental, valued only in terms of how their removal fulfills the internal logic of the offender. There is no evidence that Ethan experienced acute psychological breaks or psychotic episodes. His mental state appeared structurally intact, marked by goal-directed planning and high-order executive function. What was absent, however, was empathy, remorse, or the internal regulation of impulse through conscience. These deficits align with early-stage psychopathic development. While formal diagnosis in juveniles must be approached cautiously, the behavioral framework is consistent with traits along the callous, unemotional spectrum. His preparation phase included physical conditioning, weapon access, and narrative construction. He openly spoke about the futility of emotional bonds, dismissed religion and moral consequence, and expressed boredom with routine social expectations. These expressions, combined with symbolic gestures such as wearing body armor and fantasizing about additional killings, support the conclusion that the offense was not an end point, but a first operation, a test, a proof of capacity. One unresolved consideration remains. What internal threshold was crossed that converted rehearsal into action? And why, of all potential targets, was his mother chosen as the initial object of destruction? The answer may lie not in hatred, but in significance, in what she represented to the world he was trying to erase. The act itself unfolded with a level of control that stands in direct contrast to the brutality of its outcome. Forensic analysis confirms that the first strike delivered with the metal dumbbell was fatal, fracturing the temporal bone and producing immediate cerebral trauma. This was not exploratory violence. The force applied indicates full commitment to the act from the outset. The weapon was chosen for its proximity and its capacity to incapacitate silently. There was no shouting, no struggle, no signs of hesitation. Following the initial impact, the offender transitioned to the secondary phase of the assault. The butterfly knife, previously concealed, was retrieved and used to execute multiple penetrating wounds to the neck and upper torso. The angle, depth, and placement of the wounds show anatomical awareness. One wound punctured the carotid artery. Another damaged the trachea. The subject's behavior at this stage demonstrates cognitive continuity. He was not overwhelmed or emotionally reactive. He maintained procedural focus throughout. Post-mortem behaviors further support the conclusion that this was a premeditated, symbolic act rather than an emotional outburst. After ensuring the victim's death, the subject initiated a cleanup process, though not forensically competent. Blood was wiped from high-contact surfaces. The murder weapon was briefly rinsed, then later concealed. The room was reorganized. A candle was lit. The house pets were fed. These tasks were not executed in haste, but in sequence, reflecting an internal structure guiding his response. This controlled post-offense conduct is significant. It reflects not panic, but operational closure. One behavioral inconsistency is worth noting. The subject made no attempt to leave the scene immediately. Instead, he remained inside the residence for hours before departing. During this period, he manipulated the answering machine to simulate the victim's absence. This adjustment served no immediate tactical function, as the homicide had already occurred. However, it did serve a psychological one. It allowed the offender to momentarily inhabit a narrative in which the victim was simply away. The act of altering the outgoing message, matching the behavior of the fictional Patrick Bateman, suggests a merging of internal fantasy and external action. It was not enough to eliminate the physical presence. The offender sought to rewrite the victim's reality as well. Surveillance footage shows the subject calmly exiting the home, carrying only a backpack. No evidence suggests he disposed of clothing or weapons en route. His destination was his father's residence, where he would later stage the discovery narrative. This transition between the crime scene and the point of disclosure is crucial for understanding the offender's cognitive frame. He was not attempting to disappear or avoid identification. He was managing perception. The lie was constructed not to escape detection, but to buy time. Time to observe the response. Time to assess his own performance. In high-control offenders, the ability to delay gratification after a violent act is rare. Many immediately self-destruct, confess, or attempt to flee. Ethan did none of these. He monitored the environment. He tested how the lie would be received. He even presented physical signs of emotional disturbance, shortness of breath, a trembling voice, misaligned focus, though none consistent with actual trauma. These behavioral cues were likely rehearsed. Interviews suggest he had studied real interrogation footage online, modeling behaviors that might shield him from suspicion. What remains unclear is whether the offender anticipated full escape or if the deception was merely performative, a final act in the sequence, rather than a sustainable defense strategy. The answer may lie not in what he did after the murder, but in how he responded once that performance began to collapse. The interrogation began under controlled conditions, with a two-officer team trained in adolescent interview protocols and non-coercive elicitation techniques. The subject, seated calmly in a neutral posture, maintained appropriate eye contact and demonstrated high verbal fluency. Initial exchanges revealed no overt signs of emotional dysregulation. He answered questions without delay, avoided filler language, and corrected minor details in his own account when prompted. This level of self-monitoring is uncommon among juvenile suspects, particularly in the immediate aftermath of a homicide involving a close family member. What emerged within the first hour was not a narrative built around grief or shock, but one centered on technical precision. When asked about his movements the night prior, the subject offered time-stamped explanations with supporting sensory details, many of which were unverifiable and later contradicted by forensic evidence. This pattern of over-elaboration, coupled with an absence of effective resonance when discussing the victim, strongly suggested fabricated recall. The absence of pronouns referencing familial connection during these segments further indicated psychological distancing. As inconsistencies surfaced, investigators transitioned to a confrontational approach. The subject's response was notable. Rather than displaying confusion or defensiveness, he engaged in counter-questioning. He asked about the forensic process, whether DNA from sweat could be detected on a dumbbell grip, and whether entry wounds could indicate the handedness of an attacker. These inquiries were not rhetorical. They represented an operational interest in the boundaries of physical evidence and a premature attempt to measure his exposure. Such behavior, especially in adolescence, signals an advanced understanding of procedural mechanics and is rarely observed in individuals without prior exposure to investigative material. When directly challenged on blood pattern evidence recovered from his clothing, the subject's demeanor shifted for the first time. He adopted a controlled silence, followed by a question regarding whether lawyers were typically assigned before or after official charges were filed. This pivot marked a clear tactical recalibration. He was no longer focused on preserving the narrative of an unknown intruder. He had begun to assess the legal terrain. Throughout the session, emotional displays were minimal and contextually inconsistent. During a segment where investigators introduced a photograph of the crime scene, the subject averted his gaze briefly, then resumed eye contact and asked whether the photo was part of a public record. This reaction lacked congruence with normative trauma responses. The inquiry, again, was strategic, concerned not with the victim, but with the visibility of the evidence. It supported an emerging profile of a subject more invested in outcome management than in the implications of the act itself. After repeated confrontations, the first partial admission was elicited not through direct questioning, but through a hypothetical. When asked, "If someone had done this to her, what kind of person would they have to be? The subject responded, "Someone who was tired of being told what to feel." The statement was not immediately followed by elaboration, nor did he retract it. Instead, he sat in silence, displaying a calm that bordered on indifference. This statement, while not legally admissible as a confession, was behaviorally significant. It offered the first unsolicited glimpse into a cognitive framework defined by suppressed autonomy and emotional detachment. During the final stage of the interview, a different tactic was employed. One investigator shifted to a narrative-building approach, outlining a hypothetical story of a boy pushed too far, misunderstood, isolated in a world that didn't match how he saw himself. The subject responded visibly. His posture relaxed, and he began correcting elements of the hypothetical, subtly shifting it closer to reality. These corrections became increasingly specific until they crossed into self-reference. He described how the lighting in the room had been dim, how the first strike didn't feel real, how there was no sound except the dog barking outside. These sensory details aligned exactly with the forensic timeline and environmental data. The confession, when it arrived, was not emotional. It was linear, methodical, and delivered with the same effective neutrality that had characterized earlier interactions. The subject did not express remorse, justification, or confusion. Instead, he described the act as inevitable, something he had rehearsed mentally until it became procedural. He indicated that it had not been about anger or hatred, but clarity. That final word, clarity, raises an unresolved analytical concern. In forensic psychology, when an offender describes a violent act as clarifying, it often signals the completion of an internal narrative loop. What remains to be examined is whether this loop ended with the first victim, or if it was only the opening chapter of a broader construct not yet fully revealed. In the days following his formal confession, Ethan Wundram underwent multiple psychological evaluations. Across each session, he remained composed, articulate, and cooperative. There were no signs of cognitive impairment, mood instability, or psychotic features. His thought processes were linear. His memory was intact. He demonstrated full orientation to time, place, and purpose. What was notably absent, however, was emotional resonance. When asked about the homicide, his descriptions were detached, clinical, and devoid of affect. He referred to the act in passive terms, often shifting grammatical focus from agent to outcome. Phrases such as "it happened" or "the situation resolved" replaced direct references to killing or death. This language pattern is consistent with offenders who experience a profound disconnect between self and consequence. In forensic terms, it suggests a high degree of internal justification, where the moral weight of the act is not only suppressed but reframed as irrelevant. Ethan did not deny responsibility. He denied its emotional significance. During a structured psychopathy assessment, he endorsed items indicating superficial charm, lack of empathy, and a grandiose sense of self. His interpersonal interactions were marked by calm confidence, often attempting to redirect evaluators with counter-questions or philosophical references. He described emotions as tools and relationships as functional illusions. When asked if he regretted the murder of his mother, his response was immediate. No, she was no longer necessary. This statement was not provocative. It was stated plainly, as if reporting a completed task. Analysis of his writings, post-arrest, reinforced this profile. He maintained a journal, not as a reflection of internal struggle, but as a method of documenting and refining his thoughts. In one entry, he outlined alternative methods of disposing of a body with greater efficiency. In another, he ranked high-profile historical crimes by what he termed narrative control, evaluating not the moral or emotional content of the acts, but the perpetrator's ability to shape public interpretation. These cognitive patterns indicate a worldview, in which morality is reduced to narrative utility. The act of murder becomes, in effect, a statement, a way to control identity through irreversible action. In closed interviews, he admitted to contemplating future homicides. These were not revenge fantasies or emotionally charged projections. He viewed them as logical extensions of a process. He expressed curiosity about the psychological reactions of others, referring to empathy as a form of observable data, not as something personally accessible. His responses demonstrated cognitive empathy, the ability to recognize emotional states in others, but lacked effective empathy, the capacity to share or internalize those states. This distinction is central to understanding the risk profile of high-functioning, emotionally detached offenders. There was no evidence of remorse, guilt, or internal conflict. When presented with letters written by family members, including one from his younger sibling, Ethan exhibited no visible response. He read them silently, then returned the papers without comment. Follow-up questions regarding the content produced only analytical remarks about the writing style and structure. He did not refer to the emotional content. He did not acknowledge the grief expressed. From a criminological perspective, Ethan Wundram represents a rare but critical offender type. His behavior aligns with traits identified in emerging psychopathy during adolescence: callousness, manipulation, emotional shallowness, and a calculated pursuit of dominance through control of narrative and outcome. Unlike impulsive juvenile offenders, his act was not reactive, chaotic, or emotionally driven. It was a performance of power, executed in silence, followed by strategic observation of consequence. The legal system ultimately recognized both the severity of the act and the developmental considerations tied to his age. His original life sentence was later reviewed under evolving juvenile sentencing standards. However, the psychological data continues to raise concern regarding long-term behavioral risk. Incarceration may restrict access to future victims, but it does not, in itself, address the internal logic that justified the act. Rehabilitation models for this offender type remain limited, particularly when effective capacity is absent and motivation for change is externally imposed. The case underscores the importance of early identification of high-control behavioral patterns in youth, especially when accompanied by fascination with violence, symbolic detachment, and manipulation of authority figures. It also highlights the limitations of conventional behavioral metrics in detecting concealed pathology, masked by intelligence, charm, or outward normalcy. Ethan Wundram did not kill out of rage, revenge, or desperation. He killed because it aligned with a self-concept he had constructed over time, one that placed autonomy above attachment and narrative dominance above human connection. In the absence of remorse, the question is no longer whether he understands what he did. The question is whether, given the chance, he would choose not to do it again. The available evidence offers no reassurance.